As we were preparing for this conference, we began to think about how we might conclude what we'd hoped to be the kind of conference in which you found some real nuggets to think about, the kind of conference that maybe would fulfill my initial dream, that it would actually change the way you think about leadership, do leadership, change the way you are a leader. And I kept coming back to the idea that we have amongst us some people who have been leaders for a long time and have a lot to tell us, a lot of stories to tell. And so with their permission, I asked Tom Nees and Ed Robinson to conclude our conference by talking about their journey. And I'd like both of them to come on up at this time. The title that we finally came to is this: Journeys Toward Integrity and Wisdom, 5 important leadership lessons and stories. I think we're in for a real treat. Would you please welcome them?
Well, we can both tell you that we have not been particularly looking forward to this occasion. It is not because we have not enjoyed reflecting on our journeys, but to a large degree, it's easier to talk about theory, and it's easier to talk about what people should do than to talk about where you've been and what you've experienced, and particularly at the point of lessons learned. So I trust that tonight you will appreciate the vulnerability. And I have no idea what Tom's going to say, except he gets to talk about his exciting world of entrepreneurial leadership. And I get to talk about institutional leadership. But you can't spend time reviewing your life and your journey and important lessons that you've learned along the way without it bringing some measure of joy and also some measure of pain. And so tonight we come before you and as 2 sojourners in this world of leadership. We decided that it would be great if we had like rocking chairs and we could just kind of sit and talk to each other like a couple of old geezers on the porch. But we decided in the kind of formality of this evening that probably wouldn't work very well. So we're going to begin by just telling you a little bit about our journey in a kind of a biographical kind of way, to paint the kind of a large picture about where we've come, and then to go back and forth with each other in terms of important leadership lessons that we've learned. I've had the privilege of serving some great institutions in my life. I graduated from here in 1973 and worked for a year at a mobile home factory and then went off to seminary, and had the opportunity to serve in 2 congregations in Southern California, in San Diego First Church, and I was there just long enough to get my feet wet and to overcome those kind of professional jitters. But then I had the privilege of moving to Long Beach First Church of the Nazarene with my pastor, Jerry White, which was a church that had a storied history in terms of the denomination, but also it had a great recent history through some very fine pastors, and had created for itself an incredible master plan of a huge sanctuary and a great idea of becoming a very kind of regional mega church. And when the pastor and I came to serve in that particular location, the dream had kind of stalled, if you will. Still purchasing property, but there was a sense in which the momentum of the congregation began to slow down. And God blessed us with a ministry of immigrants from Cambodia. And I remember being a part of what I will call an ignorant strategy, meaning we had no idea what we were doing. But as God began to bring people across our pathway, we responded and did as best as we could do. And I was absolutely amazed at the kinds of things that took place. And people would ask us to say, can you come and do a seminar on how to do this ministry? I said, we could. Wouldn't take long, because we have no idea. We're just trying to keep up with what the Spirit is doing. Later in my life, I often, reading the book of Acts, thought to myself, I wish there were times and places where I could experience a kind of an Acts church. And then I pinch myself and I'm reminded that I did. And God granted the privilege of being in the middle of a movement. And I was able to sharpen my leadership skills, not because I kind of had this strategic plan that I would grow from this experience. It was thrust upon us, and we did the best we could, and God worked miracles among us with that ministry. And then I had the privilege of going back to school in a kind of a design plan, and after 2 years of doctoral program, I ended up at Nazarene Theological Seminary. And it was also an institution that had a great, long, and storied history. A history that was in my own family, my father, a place where I had gone to school and graduated, and the idea of going back to a place that had that kind of history to it and that kind of reputation and almost larger than life was a significant experience for me. I was rather young, as seminary professors go, but it wasn't very long before God offered me the opportunities there to kind of be a part of planning kind of a new future, in part by urgency, in part by opportunities that came our way as we tried to extend the offerings of the seminary to a new constituency, even a constituency in South America in terms of a doctor of ministry program. And once again, I had to run to keep up with the opportunities that God was placing before us in that place. And then on a Saturday in March of 2005, after I had settled into a comfortable position of saying I can be at the seminary for the next 10 years, I had resigned my position as the dean of the faculty. I had assigned myself an office in the basement, as far away from the administrative places as I could get. I'd volunteered to be pastor of the chapel, had assigned myself courses that I wanted to teach for the next 10 years. And I breathed a sigh of relief and thought, boy, this is going to be really good. And God on that Saturday afternoon had a different thing in mind, and I will talk about a little later, but I was elected as the president of Mid-American Nazarene University, totally out of the blue. I don't know very many places these days that do it that way, but I went to a place that I had been acquainted with, knew a few people there, but it wasn't home. And there wasn't any real emotional draw there, like, boy, we finally get to go to this place that we've loved and heard about. And before very long, God offered us again the opportunity to lead beyond our abilities, to press us into decisions and situations that caused us to have to rely upon God in some ways that we never had done in our life. I will be honest with you. It was the hardest job I've ever had. And I'm not looking forward to having another job that hard in my life. But I learned and grew. I stretched. I made mistakes. I had some successes. And I left there in some pain. Not because I wanted to, but because it was the right thing to do. And that's how I got to be here and involved in the things in which I'm involved. And along the way, I hope I grew in integrity, and I hope I grew in wisdom. I certainly learned some important lessons along the way.
As Ed and I talked about this evening, we thought we would kind of talk to one another and with you about some of the similarities and differences between institutional leadership and entrepreneurial leadership. Much of the language of leadership development is about institutional leadership, whether it's in secular world or in the religious world. I think pastors are sort of a hybrid of institutional leaders and entrepreneurial leaders, and it can vary from time to time where that emphasis comes down. I was interested in a recent report of graduate theological education that more and more seminary graduates are looking to be what I would call entrepreneurial leaders rather than going to established churches, because there aren't as many of those available as there might have been in the past for a seminary graduate. They're more inclined to try to start something, some new form of ministry. And that calls for a different set of leadership skills to be an entrepreneurial leader. I was about 12 years into what you might call traditional pastoral ministry, leaving seminary and going to Ewan, Washington. Some of you might know where that is, for 17 months, long 17 months. I made up my mind after I went to Ewan that I would never take another church again without looking at it first. I was so anxious to get out of seminary and get to a place, and I don't have time to tell you that story, but I changed my mind. After I'd been there a month or two, I said, I'll take anything else without looking at it first. And I remember in that transition, the district superintendent called, and he was calling from Northern California, E.E. Zachary. And he said, I know where you are because I once was the DS of that Northwest District, and I know exactly where you are. I've got it figured out. It's about time, I think you're probably ready to move. And I've got a church for you, but he said, I want you to pray about it and call me back. And he hung up before I could say, I'll take it. And I spent, I don't know, 2 or 3 days just hoping that he wouldn't change his mind so I could get back to him and say, the Lord told me to take this. So we moved to Sunnyvale, California. Had 4 wonderful years. And then moved from Sunnyvale to Dayton, Ohio. Now, if you want somebody to be convinced of your commitment, move from California to Ohio. Why would you move from San Francisco? And it was right when, I left my heart in San Francisco, and we moved to cloudy Dayton, Ohio in the middle of the winter. But it was a wonderful church. We had a great time. It was during that time that I found my life's work. And it was the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. I was sitting in my parsonage watching the news that Easter weekend. And when that report came over, I realized there was a world out there passing me by that I had no understanding of. Had no understanding of what was going on in the city. And I sat there and watched the burning of Washington, D.C., the flames up and down what was the Rock Corridor. And if anybody could have told me that within a few months your ministry will be in that city, and in a few years in that very location that we watched burn to the ground, I couldn't have believed it. But that's what happened. I began to make plans and thought I'd probably go to an urban center and start a church. But then an invitation came to go to Washington First in Washington, D.C. And it was a fine church in the heart of a city. In fact, one of the few churches that we have that remained in the heart of the city. And so there it was, an opportunity to go to that church. A wonderful group of people. But as I drove back and forth from our parsonage in suburban Maryland into the heart of Washington, D.C., I began to feel like this isn't it. There's still a world passing us by. I'd never been around poor people in my life. Now, in the parsonage, we weren't rich, but the church has a way of keeping you from being destitute. So we always had enough. So I really didn't know what poverty was like. I'd never been around black people. Every church that I was in was all white. Every neighborhood was all white. And I found myself with an all-white church in the middle of an all-black city. And there was a reason for that, and I won't get into it. But I began to hear a voice. I began to explore some opportunities. And before long, I realized that I needed to resign this church and follow another path. Now I'm going to talk to you about the 5 things that we're going to talk about in terms of entrepreneurial leadership. About 2 years into that ministry, I went off on a vacation with our family, and I took my little Smith Corona electric typewriter. And that shows you how long ago it was. And I went off in a corner, and I wrote my 95 theses of sorts, called The Alternate Church. About 15 pages long. I still have the original copy. And when we came off that vacation, I put it in a brown envelope, and I thought this thing was so subversive that if my DS ever saw it, it was surely the end. I carried that around and didn't share it with anybody for weeks. And finally, there was a young man who was an attorney in our congregation, and I thought I could have confidence in him. And we would go down to the Smithsonian in the mall in Washington, D.C., into the art gallery and find a corner where we were sure it was not bugged. And I would talk to him about my alternate church. That went on for a while, and I talked with just a few people around that my trusted confidants. I literally put that envelope under the pillow at night. My wife and I, we talked about this. We were absolutely convinced that if the church had any idea what we were going to do, we'd be excommunicated. And we weren't paranoid because I knew some people who had tried to do some of these things and didn't make it. So we lived with this secret. Now, let me say, in doing an entrepreneurial ministry, there is the first step. Whatever it is you want to do, you have to put it in writing. If you just talk about it, it'll just evaporate. The first step is to put it down in writing so that you can show it to somebody and say, this is what I'm envisioning. Well, the time came, and I just had to send it to my DS. And I bundled it up, put it in the mail, sent it to Roy Carnahan, and waited for the phone to ring. I knew it was the end. To my surprise, one day the phone rang, and Roy Carnahan was on the line, and he said, "Tom, this is good stuff." I couldn't have imagined that he would affirm that. And he didn't know what to do with it. And I told him I need to resign. He said, "No, you can't resign that church." I said, "Well, I think I am." And finally I did. I was on the advisory board, so I knew the district had no money. No use of ask for any financial support to do this thing. So we didn't do that. We resigned and Pat and I had gotten out of debt. I sold a car, so I had no car payments. We had no debt. Had the freedom to do what we want to do. That's another key. If you want the freedom to do what you want to do, stay out of debt. Because the debt it'll drag you down, and you won't have the freedom. So fortunately, we had 4 kids, but no debt. And so the next step in the process was to gather a group of people. And my challenge at that time was for a group of people to see this vision as their vision and not mine. That it was a vision that God was giving us, so that I had to let it go and let it become the vision of a group of people. So if you talk to those folks who were part of that original group, they to this day will say it was their vision. I was the facilitator of something that the Lord was able to used to speak into a group of people, and that became the core of this little group. That was a small group. We met for 2 years behind closed doors in the Potter's House, a little coffee shop in Washington, D.C. And for 2 years, we studied spiritual formation and read Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, Life Together. That was our text. We didn't know whether we wanted to be a church, but then we said, you know, we knew we wanted to minister in this part of the city, and our mission was really to see if we could combine the personal and the social dimensions of the gospel. Could we reach out into that impoverished neighborhood and make a difference, and at the same time affirm our faith in Christ and bring people to faith and be working on housing and health care and all of the things that we got into? Well, it took a while. In fact, I spent 2 years working in a neighborhood in a housing project before I ever told anybody I was a minister. I was so unsure of what I was doing, and it was so embryonic that I wasn't able to defend it, that, you know, I just thought that was the right way to begin. When we finally did announced that we were a church, and actually that happened because a group of students and faculty from NNU came back to Washington, D.C. and spent a full month with us and helped renovate an old dilapidated apartment, and that became our chapel. And those folks left us. They brought the money to do all of the work, all these students and faculty from NNU, and when they left, we had a place to worship, and we announced we're going to have church, and the people in the neighborhood said, "What? Why didn't you tell us you were a minister?" I wouldn't have said what I said, you know. I said, "That's why I didn't tell you." But finally, you know, he broke out. So some of my 5 lessons for starting for entrepreneurial leadership: 1, put it in writing. Number 2, you've got to get a group of people around you. You've got to get a good group. And they have to own this thing. It can't be just mine. It has to be something that a group of people own. Then you've got to organize it. We started as basically a mission church. I had to organize a church board. Nothing is going to last until you institutionalize it. Comes a point along the line where you have to provide a structure for this thing. So we had to organize it, kind of condensing. Then you have to have a business plan. Through the years, I had dozens, hundreds of people come by the Community of Hope and say, "I want to do this." My first response is, "No, you don't want to do this." I can tell you why you don't want to do this. However, I can tell you a process that you can go through. And whatever you do will be contextualized to your situation. It will be nothing like this because there's not another neighborhood like this. There's not another group of people like this. It'll be your own people, it'll be your own context, your own place. And so you have to, but the process is, number 1, if you're going to be an entrepreneurial leader, first thing you do is write it down. Put it in writing so you can communicate it to some other people. Get a group of people around who will commit themselves to this idea and own it. So it's theirs as much as yours. Then organize it. We organized a church and then eventually a 501c3 organization which we could use to raise money. Then have a business plan. Used to have a lot of people come to me and say, well, when I was working and helping start these nonprofits out of the Gold Minute, people who were doing good work and feeling like the church owed them some money because they were so dedicated. I said, no, nobody owes you anything. Now, I could help people figure out how to raise money, and I did a lot of that out of my own experience. But no matter how good your idea is, if you can't figure out how to pay for it, it's not going to go anyplace. So, you get down to something very practical. How do I put together the financial plan that is needed in order to bring this ministry to life? And there are ways of doing it, and we can work with one another. And let me go clear to the end. 20 years later, I knew it was my time to leave. One of the big problems for organizations where the founding director is still there is succession. And any organization where there is a question about succession is unstable. People are wondering, what's going to happen when the leader disappears? Will the organization remain vital? I had to, by that time, we had the church and we had the nonprofit, and I was the pastor of the church and the executive director of this growing nonprofit organization. And I had to find two people because the job was too big for one person and he'd be divided up. So I went through a year grooming people to succeed me. One of the big challenges was creating a board that would hold me accountable. I had seniority over everybody. I had brought them all in, so they were accustomed to deferring to me. Really had to resist that. And so it would become a board-driven organization rather than a staff-driven organization. And the board would take hold of this thing, hold me accountable, and then go through the succession project. And in the end, when I realized I needed to let this thing go, and that every entrepreneurial leader has to go through this. This is your baby. You've created this thing. You've started this thing, whether it's a church or an organization. At some point, you've got to let it go. I was struggling with it. And one of the guys that came to faith, Vance, still a part of the church, struggling with this thing. I said, they can't make it without me, and I can't make it without them. And I was caught in this thing. And Vance came to me one day and he said, you know, Tom, he said, if you don't step aside, I can't step forward. That was the word of the Lord. And I think that's another thing of engagement and disengagement. And at some point, leaders have to figure out when to disengage in order that other people can step forward. And so I think my 5 points for entrepreneurial leadership is: one, write it down, get a group around that own it, organize it, develop a business plan so that you can afford to do this thing, and someday let it go. Every entrepreneurial new start becomes an institution, and that's where it merges. So it isn't that there's this big divide between entrepreneurial leadership and institutional leadership, because you become an institutional leader sooner or later after you get something started. But there are some unique, I think, skills that are required. We did while I was at the Global Ministry Center, we used our money to help get things started. We had a startup grant, and we incorporated these ideas into a grant program, and we would provide financial assistance to entrepreneurial programs, but they had to meet some standards that we had set, and basically they were these. And if you had an idea and you had gone through these steps, we were willing to use the money, contributed to Compassionate Ministries to help you get started. And we started over 200 nonprofit organizations during that period of time using this model. And now, of course, the emphasis on starting new churches, the same skills are required. I don't know, Ed, how that ties in with where your life has led you, but we can talk about entrepreneurial.
Okay. I have my 5.
Okay.
So
good.
Okay. All right. As I said, most of my leadership and ministry has been spent in institutions, very established ones, and most of them with long and storied histories. So I have kind of 5 leadership lessons that I've learned. This is number 1, that all of the institutions have had a history and a culture, and some of them very deep and rich. And I learned that to lead well meant that I had to both value and honor the significances of those histories and the culture of the past, while working to create vision and a momentum for the future. I call it standing on the shoulders of those who've gone before you. One of the things about inheriting an institution in terms of leadership is that somebody was there before you got there, and somebody sacrificed and paid a price. And even if it's an opportunity for a new day and a new direction needs to take place, people bled and gave and suffered. I remember my first President's Dinner after coming to Mid-America, and I started in July of 2005, and it was my responsibility to kind of host a dinner in August at the beginning of school, and we would hand out awards, and and I got to make my first kind of presidential kind of stump speech to the group, and I worked really hard at it, and I felt like we had a pretty successful evening. And at the conclusion of the evening, the spouse of the founding president, who had died several years earlier, but the spouse was still living, and she wandered up to the front of the auditorium, and I didn't know her at all. I knew of her, and I knew which person she was because everybody pointed her out to me. Now you need to know who she is. And she came up, and without a smile, she looked at me and she said, if you were a student here when my husband was president, they would have kicked you out for that hair on your face. And I looked at her and I said, if you were here when your husband was president, they'd have kicked you out for wearing those pants. And a sparkle and a grin came on her face. And from that moment on, she called me her president. Not because I could match wit for wit, but because she recognized the fact, not only that I knew who she was, but that I honored the commitment and legacy that she had given to the university. Nancy and I visited her duplex often. Out her front window, she could see the school. She called it her baby. Are you taking care of my baby? And I would say to her often, we are doing the best we can. And it wasn't just for her, it was the whole culture and instance of the whole institution. That when you inherit an institution and you are its leader, you cannot vilify the past nor the leaders of the past, because if you do, you will never make it into the future. Honoring the culture and history of the past while setting a climate for a vision and a momentum for the future. Lesson number 2, institutional leaders are not called. Institutional leaders are called, they are not hired. You see, the consuming responsibility of being in charge is too great a task for a job. An effective leader must commit to the institution. You have to embrace its mission, and you have to love its people. You're never just hired to be the leader for a time. For you see, the cost is too great to endure the challenges that come with leadership. I remember, as I said before, the evening that we got the call, I was actually laying on the couch in our living room, and I had just said to Nancy, do we have anything tonight? And she said, no. I said, great. And I was just laying there, and we were watching a video of an English story that Nancy was watching and pursuing for a class that she was teaching. And my phone vibrated behind my head. And I picked it up and I said, this is Ed. And the voice on the other end said, this is Dr. So-and-so. I'm from, and he told the city he was from, and my initial thought was, why is a layman from that church calling me? Usually the pastor calls if they want you to come and speak. And then he said, I'm the chairman of the board at Mid-American Nazarene University. And I thought, well, that's nice. And he said, I'm pleased to tell you that you've just been elected the 4th president of Mid-America. And I said, oh my goodness. And Nancy, who was on the other side of the living room, she was looking at me, and she said, you became this kind of ashen gray. And the last time that had happened, it was news that somebody in our family had died. And so she wanted to know who died. And so I was trying to voice to her, still listening on the phone, MNU. And she thought to herself, poor Dr. Spindle, he's died. Here he is just about ready to retire, and he's died. And so she started praying for the Spindle family. And so finally I kind of got the message across to her that this was the chairman of the board, and I'd just been elected the president of Mid-America. And then she went, "Oh my goodness." And after we went through a few formalities, and actually the whole board of trustees was sitting in the room, and they wanted to do a kind of a conference call so that they could all kind of offer their congratulations. And and they said they would like for you to say something. And I said, well, I'm honored, humbled. And then I said, Nancy and I have always desired to do what God wanted us to do. And about now, that's about all I can tell you. I need some time to think about this. No interview, no opportunity to ask those critical questions in either direction. And then as soon as I hung up the phone, I said to Nancy, if we're going to do this, we're going to have to love them. Not that it's hard, but to be honest, we're alums of NNU. And if you ask us, our favorite college in the world is NNU. But I said, if we do this, we are going to have to love them, and not from a distance. We will need to become pioneers. You see, you can't lead an institution as a hired hand. You have to become part of them. And the way in which you do that is not first to kind of figure out how to lead. The way you begin to do that, I discovered, is to begin to love them. To love their people, and to love their story, and to embrace their mission. Lesson number 3. That not everyone follows in the same way or style I lead. And so expanding my leadership abilities is far more effective than expecting everybody else to expand their followership abilities. And there is a tendency, particularly in executive leadership, that the whole world has to adjust to the leader. Well, there's a new sheriff in town, so let's figure out how this sheriff operates, and then the whole system has to kind of rework or kind of restructure itself around the new sheriff who's in town. And I learned early on that not everybody is led the same way. And it was a learning curve for me, trying to figure out how to lead this group or that group or those individuals or that individuals. And frankly, I stumbled along the way. For some, it was simply sticking my head in the door of the bookstore and waving at the ladies in there and saying, "Hi, how y'all doing today?" Oh, and the president has honored us with his presence. Pretty easy to do. Others, I thought, well, I'll just let them do their jobs, and they were waiting for me to tell them what to do. And they needed to be told what to do, not in a pejorative way, but they were waiting for a strong sense of direction. My style is to cheer for people and say, go and do it. But I needed to help some direct. There are others that I had to massage the requests over time, because it wasn't just about their ability, it was also about their sense of worth. And I couldn't tell them, go and do that, without first building up their kind of, I wanted to say egos, building up their confidence, building up their sense of who they were, and frankly, giving worth to what I was asking them to do. And that's not an easy task, and it takes time to figure out. But you are, in executive leadership, the president of the whole institution. And even though you're not responsible for every detail, everybody looks to you for that sense. So, lesson number 3. Lesson number 4. Institutional leaders become icons of their institutions. Learning to be yourself as an icon is the key to long-term and effective leadership. You can't help it. People see the institution through your personality, through your words, through your presence. I remember not long after we accepted the presidency of Mid-America, I got a call from a newspaper reporter. And I would, that It's never happened to me in my life before. Nobody really cared what I thought or, anything. And now I get a call from the local newspaper reporter, and she asked me some things, and I thought I answered pretty well. And then she said to me, "Are you going to move to Olathe?" And I thought to myself, no. I live 10 minutes from the school now, and why would I spend $100,000 just for a new address? And I didn't say it quite that crassly, but we live close to the institution, and so, and instead of, having had the public relations seminar, which I should have said, well, it's way too early for those kinds of decisions. We're still trying to figure things out, I just said no. I thought it was an honest answer, And so the next day, the newspaper editorial comes out from the newspaper editor, and it's about all of the wonderful things about the university and my qualifications to serve there, and about how this is going to be a wonderful transition and paying homage to my predecessor. And then the last paragraph. We do hope, however, that Robinson will reconsider his decision not to live in Olathe. He will be the first president of Mid-America not to call Olathe home. And I thought to myself, the three other people who were presidents all lived there to begin with. And then the next day, an envelope came in the mail, and it was from a lady in College Church of the Nazarene who had circled that article, sent it to me, and said, "We're praying for you." I thought, this is so silly. Until I began to understand the importance of an icon, and about how important the person of the leader is to the organization, because you, as you reminded us the other day, you're never not the president. You're never not teaching theology by your life, and everybody's watching you. We never did move. I thought I could kind of wait that one out, and I said to Nancy, we're going to go to every Olathe thing in the world. We'll be there more than the people of Olathe are. And every time I went, I looked for the newspaper editor. And when I didn't see him, I would send him a little note. "We were at Frontier Days, missed you." Whenever I would go to meetings where it was, I said, "Well, Dan, we missed you the other day at the Rotary Club." But this idea of an icon, you're never not the president. Nancy used to say to me on occasion when I was ready to do something kind of frivolous or foolish, "Ed, you're never not the president. Be careful who's watching. You're never." And in part you want to say, just be yourself and, don't worry about it. But you do have to worry about it, because you don't just represent yourself. Now, I didn't have to walk around a coat and tie everywhere I went, but you become an icon of the organization, the institution that you represent. And it's not a burdensome responsibility. In fact, it comes to the place where you consider it to be a privilege, a wonderful opportunity. But in leadership, you must learn to be yourself as an icon, or you will continually be in turmoil. And then the last. The more established and the more complex institutions become, the more prone leaders are to isolation. That old adage, "it's lonely at the top," is absolutely true. Because when you are in positions of leadership in an institution, some decisions can only be made by you. And there's nobody who will stand next to you. There are a lot of people who will stand behind you, but not very many people who will stand right next to you when those decisions need to be made. Can't tell you how many times that Nancy and I heard, "Oh, you must be very busy," which is why we didn't invite you to come and participate in our social activity. Or, "Well, we just know that you probably don't go to things like," well, we would if we were asked. But the assumption is that we have this kind of life of our own set apart and above. And there were times when, not that occasional night when you're home and that you're really glad you have nothing to do, but in particular seasons of time when everybody was going someplace and you weren't going anywhere. Which is, by the way, why the fellowship of others who are in similar situations is so precious to you. And so there are wonderful opportunities, and there are wonderful privileges, and there are wonderful occasions to be with people and to meet people that you probably would not meet otherwise. But I must also tell you that there is also the susceptibility to isolation. The next one is that the more established and complex institutions are, the more susceptible leaders are to be misinterpreted and also to be misunderstood. Honestly, this was one of the most painful things for me, to hear through the grapevine what people were saying about me. And I would say to myself, nobody has ever said that about me before in my life. Impersonal, not relational. And it was before strength, stuff, I knew anything about that. And honestly, I don't like the strength thing because there's nothing relational in my top 5 gifts or strengths. Nor in the next 5, nor in the next 5 after that. They are down there somewhere. And so maybe I just don't know myself very well, but nobody's ever told me that before. And I thought to myself, is it the position? Is it the responsibilities that push me in that direction? And almost to the point of a paranoia that I need to make sure to say hi to everybody. That you can't walk down the sidewalk without saying hi, 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 hi. So, when I got back to my office, did I check every hi off the list of that? Because I can't, it's like, did I miss somebody along the way? Or you have no privilege of thinking out loud. Because every word that comes out of your mouth is taken seriously by somebody. And even if you say, I'm just thinking out loud now, it doesn't matter. And even though we don't really believe in our traditions in ex cathedra, but it's almost everything that the president says is ex cathedra. And so you have to guard your words carefully, and that guarded speech can sometimes stifle the creativity and the energy of a conversation. And so it's almost like, from a leadership standpoint, you need a safe place to think out loud with people who will allow you to do that without jumping to conclusions about what you've decided or the direction that we're headed, will allow the process to be creative and allow brainstorming to take place rather than jumping to conclusions. The more susceptible leaders are in established and complex institutions to be misinterpreted and misunderstood. And then my last, which is a part of this established and complex institution, that the more central the mission is to decision making. For you see, the wider the spread of the organization and the more hands and the creativity that's in it, the more important the mission becomes in terms of establishing priorities and what it is you need to do. You see, when you're a leader, you will be criticized, and sometimes you deserve it. But the thing that will help you to weather the criticism is if you're staying on mission. We talked earlier this morning that process is important and integrity is important, but if you're staying on mission, then you can always point to, this is the reason we're doing this, or this is the reason we're moving forward. Toward the end of my tenure there, and I will trust you as an audience, toward the end of my tenure there, we were facing some stiff financial circumstances. We were an overcommitted and under-resourced institution. We weren't alone. But we had gotten ourselves into some awful, severe bond covenants that were pressing us to the point in which it was causing stress internally and externally. And we were feeling the pressure, sometimes on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis. Now, to give credit to God's faithfulness, we never missed a payment to anybody. We never missed a payroll. We did have to, kind of not give raises, and we did have to make some budget cuts, and there were some times when we had to do what we call reduction in force, when we had to make some critical choices about limiting the people who worked there. And I will tell you that it was all done from our knees and with great pain. But we came to a situation where we were trying to both pray and find a way out. And there was a lending institution, the traditional financial institutions in the midst of recession, that they were of no help to us, and our historic bank that we had used from day one and were a wonderful community partner were also under threat of being taken over by the FDIC. So they couldn't help us anymore. I still remember the day the president of the bank came into my office in late afternoon and with anguish in his eyes told us that they wouldn't be able to help us anymore. And so a lending institution was looking at us, and they asked the important and critical questions with the cabinet and the executive committee of the Board of Trustees about our situation, about our plan, about what kind of strategies that we might have in place. They commended us for the difficult choices that we'd made up to that point, and we were trying to be on target to end the year in the black, but not without some sacrifice and pain. And I remember the leader of the group who had come said, "Now we've heard that there's some tension between the constituency and the president." And as you might imagine, during times of this kind of crisis. And so he asked the question, "Are you willing to fight for your job?" And I looked him in the eye and I said, "No, I'm not willing to fight for my job. I'm willing to fight for the mission of the institution." That was an important moment for me because it was not too many weeks hence that in a conversation with the board, it became evident to me that the best thing for the institution was for me not to fight for my job. So I did what I thought was best, among great pain, in what perhaps was the darkest day of my life to that point. Oh, both of my parents passed away, but they both passed away saints. No, it was the darkest day of my life. And I had to deal with the issue of integrity in my own heart. I had to deal with the sense of my own value as a leader. And I had to deal with this hole in my heart that I had given my best in my life to a place that I loved. And I still do. There's much to be said about the dynamics of that day, but the first thing I did after I gathered my leadership partners with me, the leadership team of the university, and told them, I said to Nancy, I want our family to be together tonight. Because I need them. There were many who wanted to say nice things. There were even members of the board who wanted to say nice things to me. I told them I wasn't in a real mood to hear it at the time. I said, you can do that later. But I also said to Nancy, we are going to leave in a way that we can come back, because you can't turn off your heart to a place that you've loved. And we've had opportunity on a couple of occasions to go back, and we hold our heads up, and we enjoy and celebrate the wonderful victories that God is bringing. We pray that God will continue to lead. But it is part of the dynamic of institutional leadership. Because you don't, even from a position of executive, officer, pastor, or whatever, you don't control the world. And nor do you control even the world of the institution of which you're a part. You give your best, and when you leave, whether it's in the situation like Tom expressed, that it's time to go to make space for somebody else, or you leave because it's the right thing to do even when you don't want to, you leave with grace so that you can become part of the institution's history and a part of its story and a part of its legacy, even though the times may be difficult. There are times when I think to myself, I would much rather be an entrepreneurial leader. God has not offered me that privilege. But I am better today for all of the lessons of leadership that I have learned. And frankly, I really enjoy being a follower now. And I pray for my president. And I pray for those who are in positions of leadership in the institution. These are not easy times to lead. But with God's grace and God's help, if the mission's worth it, we can do it. And we can do it together. Thank you.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. You can't plan for things as good as those two. That was awesome. Although we now have time for some Q&A. Why don't you guys stand up and come forward so folks can see you a little bit easier. That might be better. Those of you who are watching online, remember that you can tweet questions into WesleyConf. That's hash marks WesleyConf, and emails at wesleyconf@nnu.edu. Man, I don't even know where to go after those two things. Powerful stuff. Thanks to both of them. That's true. Let's take a few questions, however. Jay, would you mind being a mic guy here? I think we have one other mic. Grant, do we have some other mics there? Excellent. There's one. And that'd be great, Mark. Yeah. Tell you what. Oh, okay. Why don't you stand over here by Tom? I'll stand over here, and you guys can pass that mic back and forth. Questions, comments. Two powerful stories, two very different stories. Two very powerful stories with insights for leadership. I wonder what you'd like to ask these two leaders.
It seems like, as we've heard both stories, that leadership involves an amount of pain. And I wonder if you want to talk about that. Sometimes I think we think that we can just get by.
You're the one with the mic.
Well, there certainly are in ministry painful moments, you know. I can remember when we had board meetings for the express purpose of shutting the whole thing down. We had no idea that we could continue on. And usually those were financial issues, but somehow we learned the lesson of faith. I wish there was another way, but it's the loaves and fishes thing, you know. The disciples want to tell the crowds to go away, and Jesus said, no, you give them something to eat. Of course, they had nothing. How do you do that? Well, you take the little bit you've got and break it and bless it, and somehow God multiplies it. We learn that lesson of faith so often, but in our judgment, there was no way that this thing could continue. Those were painful moments when we felt like we were losing it. But somehow we made it through, and you build on those experiences. And I tell you, what kept me going was what I began to understand as the resurrection stories. We had people come to faith with such remarkable turnaround stories that I felt like our theology of conversion and so forth wasn't strong enough language to express what was happening in the lives of people who literally were the zombies, the walking dead, but they came to life. And I found that preaching resurrection, people understood that. So you need a few resurrection stories in your life to keep you going through the pain, you know, because you're not going to win everybody. But if you got a few around in your church, some before and after stories, somebody came to faith, and somebody's life was saved, and that. And then, of course, a lot of other things through the housing ministry and the healthcare ministry and jobs and so forth. You saw people improve. And so those kind of personal victories kind of carried you through the organizational struggles and gave you determination to keep doing it.
Yeah, there are two things for me. One is the same thing, the stories that emerge out of community life together. And frankly, even in the midst of all of the stresses and pressures that are there, good things still happen. And a group of students go to Guatemala and they ask questions like, okay, what do they really need here and how much does that cost? And then they come back and say, well, we can raise that. And every reasonable thing says, no, you can't. And then they end up doing it and actually building a clinic in Guatemala. And now they say, what's next? Okay, where shall we go? In the midst of a financial stress and crisis. But students didn't, you know, they don't feel that same thing. And they knew that something was going on. But to them, life, it's not just that life goes on. You don't stop the mission. The mission keeps going. And I also had the privilege of 4 very dear friends that we met together on a regular basis, all of us in kind of similar situations. And we supported one another and prayed for one another, and were a discerning group for one another in terms of some decisions that we needed to make on a very personal level. And I am indebted to those people. I wish that we could have met once a week, but our travel schedules weren't allowed, but we met at least once every 3 weeks, and sometimes once every week if we'd get together and say, okay, when's the next time we can absolutely be together? So there was a small group of support that was very critical. It didn't, it doesn't make the pain go away or the suffering, but it does, there is somebody who can understand with you and support you.
Excellent. Let's go to the web.
Tom, you asked for comments too. There were several that came into Twitter. I'll just share 2. One was, appreciate Dr. Ed Robinson's vulnerability and candid perspective this evening at the Wesley Conference.
Yeah.
And the other was, questions? I think it should have been an altar call.
Well, the buses will wait if we need to.
And then there is one question that just came in through email, and it's this. It's a question to you, Tom. In light of your experience, how would you define looking at it first when considering pastoral leadership? I think that was in reference to the church that you didn't look at first.
I'm going to step back just a little bit in case
Well, I came up under the old school in many ways, because the first 3 churches, well, all of the churches that I went to, Sunnyvale, Dayton, Beaver Creek, Washington First. I did not do an interview ahead of time. I did not preach a trial sermon. That's unheard of anymore. In each instance, it was a general superintendent or a district superintendent who threw, and in fact, 2 district superintendents say, "You've been called to this church, I have no idea who you are." But we don't do it that way anymore. And I'm not sure that we're doing it any better than we did in the past. I thought about that, but you know, I think it's important for district superintendents to do all they can to get a good match between a pastor and a church. So I guess I would feel better about the way things are going now, when there's more intentionality of getting a good marriage between a pastor and a church, than doing like it was when I was coming up, where you know, you met for the first time your first Sunday there.
I really don't even know how to pose this as a question, but one of the thing missing in a list here that has been consistent has been the role of our families and your wives, your children, and the critical point in there that they play in the healing, in the going through all of this. Leadership often has a strain on our families and our marriages. And so, like I said, I don't have a specific question, but can you speak to leaders and the value of maintaining integrity in the marriage, and the family, et cetera?
You know, in my case, Nancy and I have served together everywhere we've been. There have been really periods of adjustment for her, because when we were working in local churches together, it was kind of like I know where, you know, I find my spot, I do what I do, etc. And then when you go to a place where you're not in an executive position, or you're following in the legacy of somebody who's gone before you, Nancy always kind of had to kind of find her way through. And I've always believed in her talents and abilities, frankly, sometimes more than she does. And I've always wanted her to find and exercise those gifts and strengths. I think the struggles that we went through, in part because of the isolation, that we had each other, and in times that was all that was it. We were a part of a local church, and during particular times of struggle, we felt even very lonely in our own congregation, because there were people who wouldn't speak to us because of decisions that we had to make. And so we, you know, there's certain times we'd say, okay, let's go late and leave early. And then one Sunday, and I don't mind saying this, I mean, even though it's being broadcast out, because but one of the workers that we had to lay off on that Sunday after that, guess who was greeting at the door when we showed up? And I almost said to Nancy, let's duck out and go in another door. And she met us, and she looked at me with a sense of compassion and said, it'll be all right. And it was like a balm or a blessing. But there were others who would never speak to us again, and we'd known them for 20, 25 years. And so there were times when it was just us, and that's all we had. We did, and Nancy started really pressing me at the point of Sabbath. One of the things that you get to do as a university president is you get to go to pastors and spouses retreats all the way across the region. And Dan Spate kept showing up. I hate that guy. You know, he's a physician from Arizona, and he was, you know, doing this Sabbath thing and all of this medical research, and you know, and he gobbledygooked it up with some biblical stuff, and you know. And as soon as I would go and I heard that Dan was a speaker, I would just say to Nancy, I'm not going to like this. Because he would say, you need to take Sabbath. And he addresses the issues of burnout. And so by the time he finished the first night, you know, I'd be sitting there, not feeling guilty, just bad. And Nancy be in tears. You know, and she would say, okay, when are you going to take Sabbath? When are you going to take Sabbath? When are you going to take your Sabbath? And so she was the one who cared about my health more than anybody else did. She cared about it more than I did. And she cared about my well-being, and she was the one who was kind of the steady one. Everybody knows she's more spiritual than I am, but she was the one who kept pressing me to say, how are you caring for yourself, and how are you taking care of yourself? And when we had opportunities to be away, we did our best to be away. And those were precious moments to us. It didn't always work out, because sometimes when you're in an institutional crisis, the phone rings a lot more. We wasted it. We wasted one vacation. I spent it on the phone. And felt bad for her. And so we went back later on another occasion and actually enjoyed the place. But we didn't really enjoy it that much. So that would be my response to you. And by the way, our children were grown. So they were a support structure, primarily because they knew when their parents needed their company and the joy of our grandchildren being with us.
We've just had I think if Pat were here and she were able to join me with this, we would agree that it's been a wonderful ride. We were married in Lewiston, Idaho in 1958, in May of 1958. We moved to Nampa here, and a month later we moved into the parsonage at Middleton, Idaho Church. So during my senior year of college, I was pastor of a church. I.F. Younger had a church, and he said, you know, I've got a place out here, and you can't do it any harm. So we lived out there. I mean, it was tough. Little old church out in the middle of a farm, but as we were driving back and forth, and Pat was working for her uncle Walter Nichols over here at the campus corner, and we were just. One other part of this too, my kids often will ask me, Dad, did you ever get fired from a job? Yes, I did. My senior year of college, I was pastoring a church, I was driving a school bus, going to college, had a new bride, and I was working at the meatpacking plant out here, Kimes. Anybody know about Kimes meatpacking plant? And my job was to do the night cleanup at the meatpacking plant. Well, one night I was a little sleepy and I didn't clean up too well. And when I came in the morning, I got the pink slip. I had to go home and tell my wife, I got fired. Anyway, that was a good lesson. Only time I ever got fired from a job, but, I don't know why I got off under that. But I think, and our kids, I could never have done the inner city stuff if it hadn't been a partnership. And we first found a place to put our kids in school where we knew they would be settled, because I didn't want to disrupt their lives with this sort of entrepreneurial experimental thing. But I think our kids look back now, those were wonderful years. They were fun years, going down to they were embraced by the people in the neighborhood. We now have, you know, the Christmas card list goes back to people in every church we've had. We feel so loved and embraced by all of the places that we've been privileged to serve. It just has been a wonderful experience. And I can't, you know, there were struggles, I suppose, but I don't remember them, really. And I think if we talk about it often, how blessed we are and all these people all across the country, places we've been that have been so rewarding. So I think Ours has been a very rewarding, and now in these years, particularly rewarding to remember the places we've been and the people who stay in touch with us and so forth. It's been a great time.
More appreciation coming in from Twitter. This bit along with a question and an appreciation for the vulnerability expressed tonight. And the question or statement, we need more transparency in organizations, churches, schools, etc. How do we create such space?
The sense of transparency is, if you mean by transparency more communication, that's not necessarily transparency. I was really taken by a comment made by one of my faculty colleagues here recently when we were talking about more communication, and he said, well, if you're asking for more communication and they just keep telling you things you don't want to hear, then is that really helpful? I think the question of transparency is an issue of trust and trusting in the information. And institutional trust, and particularly trust in leadership, is a very fragile thing. And that's why I said earlier today that the ability to switch directions and to ask for forgiveness, but to do it in the context of pursuing the mission, rebuilding trust is an arduous and a long journey task, and you have to keep doing it over and over again, because to lose it, you can lose it in one event or instance, but it's not gained back in one event or instance. It takes a series of trustworthy kinds of decisions and trustworthy conversations to restore it. But the important thing, particularly when you're dealing with an institutional culture and you're dealing with decision making, is the information has to be good. And there are sometimes when institutions hand out information to people, and the information's either wrong or the next time you bring it out, it doesn't match what you brought out last time. And so, particularly in financial situations, when you stand up one week and say, we're making progress, and then you stand up the next week and say, well, we really weren't making progress because we forgot this and we forgot that and we forgot that. That kind of lack of trust is not a lack of trust in being deceiving. It's a lack of trust in competency of leadership. And one of the other challenges that I faced in the situation, that is finding the right people to take those executive positions where the right information and the right kind of expertise and competency. And one of the things I'm most proud of, even in the midst of leaving, was the executive team that I left in place there. I honor them and I'm grateful to them, and they were people who are continuing to do a really great job for the institution.
A comment and a question. As an alumnus of Mid-America, even though I've been long gone, I feel a lot of pain in my heart tonight. And my prayer would be that in time you will be able to come to increasing peace, and that the memories will be increasingly good for you. My question, you spoke about the process of how leadership was chosen with no opportunity for the interview and for critical questions on both sides. I know it's a moot point now at this stage, but looking back on that, had you had that opportunity, and perhaps you've thought about this, I don't know, do you think there might have been red flags on either side, or would you have been able to identify potentially any of these landmines or other things? And if somebody called you tomorrow and said, we're pleased to inform you you've been chosen the next president of, would you insist on perhaps that opportunity to ask those questions?
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. Thanks very much, and also for your very empathetic sentiments, and I appreciate that. There were a lot of joys along the way, so it's not like, boy, it was a hard job, and I think any president in an institution of higher education, any place, it's a very difficult job. But Nancy and I don't mind having been there. If I had, if it would have happened differently, I probably still would have gone. Because we went not with a sense of, kind of gee willikers, they elected us, we have to kind of go. There was a real sense of God's calling in our life to go, and that calling sustained us in some pretty kind of challenging times. I don't know that I was smart enough then. I was kind of like you were. I didn't even know how to read a complicated financial spreadsheet, but I do now. And I would have asked, if I had to do it over again, I would ask some critical questions, not to decide whether I would go or not, but to know what I was going to. And part of the difficulty was that there wasn't a lot of a sense of awareness. And of course, you remember the financial times were shifting in 2005 and 2006 and 2007, that the recession and the kinds of implications for financial institutions kind of caught everybody by surprise. So in a normal time, there were a lot of real estate assets and all of those sorts of things, but in the last part of the last decade, and there wasn't any financial institutions who were interested in real estate as collateral. They wanted liquid capital. And I would say to them, if we had liquid capital, I wouldn't be talking to you. Kind of a deal. It's like, if we had liquid assets, we wouldn't need you, but we don't. And so there would be different questions that I would ask, but I'm not, I told somebody the other day I might be better informed to make some decisions, not unilateral, but to make some of the decisions that needed to be made later. I would have made them earlier in the process. But I'm a crusader, but I'm still a pioneer. And to be honest, every Saturday night I go to the website and check out the athletic scores. After I check out the NNU ones. And for a while there, the institution, and we had people come from other places, when they used the name of their old school in a speech, they had to provide refreshments at the next gathering of the meeting. So we gather next March, right? And all of us, we gathered together, so, yeah.
I'm going to the last question of the evening.
Okay. Last one from the web is this. What is the most important piece of advice you would give to young men and women just beginning their leadership journey?
Their what?
Their leadership journey.
I'll let you start that. I've talked too much already.
Well, I think in the youthful years, you want to encourage the enthusiasm, the idealism. I think we've talked about some of the key components of good leadership, and I would spend time, if I'm talking to young people about their life's work, how to find it, how to prepare for it, how to follow it. Young people today are going to go to many jobs. Pastors are going to go to several churches. So I think it's important to really have some sense of grounding in terms of these values. And one story about the values, and I was thinking about it with Walter Wright's comments about the importance of values. A week ago I was with a group of people, and we were listening to recently retired chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen. And he was saying that early in his life he developed a set of values, core values by which he would live and lead. And every time he was given a new command, he sent those values on ahead of him to the people that he was going to be working with. and he would put those values on the wall in his office so that everybody would know this is what guides my life, and this is what will guide my leadership while I'm with you. And I think it's important early on to develop that sense of value, and I liked what he did. I wish I'd have thought of that early on and just said, okay, if you want me, this is who I am, and this is how I'm going to live, and by God's grace, this is how I'm going to lead. So I think being settled in those kinds of values that ground your life is important.
Yeah, I would just a few short statements. Don't settle for small dreams. Trust the voice of God. And be a person of integrity.
Thanks, both of you, so much. And actually, I want to invite Walter and Tammy back up, if you don't mind. All right. Walter, if you and Tammy could come on up while Tammy just speaks.
Just a point of personal privilege, Doctor. As the General Superintendent, anytime we were on assignment, an assembly, a world mission trip, whatever, we always had to make a report. So we always had to do homework and present that to the Board of General Superintendents. I wasn't commissioned to do that, but I'm programmed to make a response. And I feel like it is appropriate from a personal standpoint, having had this awesome privilege to come and represent the Board of General Superintendents, to say not only personally, but on behalf of the board, how much I have appreciated this incredible conference. And I want to commend you and all the leaders. And having been over the journey with these two particular gentlemen, and knowing their hearts and hearing their hearts has been heartwarming. I reflected a bit on some of the experiences. And I couldn't help but think when Tom Nees was talking about going to his first church and in the old school of no awareness of where you were going. I was a district superintendent for 20 years, 5 in one and 15 in another, and then after being general superintendent, I was recycled and served for almost 3 years as a district superintendent again on an interim basis. I think I was influenced in how I approached pastors about a particular assignment by what happened in my early childhood. My father, who was a pastor, went across country to accept an assignment, totally unaware except by the information that had been given to him by the district superintendent, who had described this church and this parsonage in remarkable terms. And when our family pulled up there, as I understand it, on Sunday morning, my dad said to my mother, now my dad was an honor graduate of Northwest Nazarene University. My mother was from this country, so he had a good perspective. But he made this comment: having received the information from the district superintendent about the parsonage and the church, and seeing no resemblance of what he had been told, he said to my mother, "Are all district superintendents liars?" My own father became a district superintendent for 29 years. He would talk to a pastor over the phone and tell him everything that he could think negative about the church. And my mother would say to him, "WT, that person will never come to this church." "Oh, yes, he will, honey. And when he comes, it'll be so much better than he thought he was that he'll be happy." So that, I think, helped shape my understanding of openness and transparency. I couldn't help but think, just quickly, and it's a bit personal. I heard Dr. Ed say that leaders are called, not hired. I received a surprise call in 1989. And I'm being a little transparent here. I was informed that I had been elected president of Mount Vernon Nazarene College. Not only was I surprised, but a lot of people in the church were surprised. And I went. We made a visit. We struggled for 1 week. I had the confidence of the board. I had the call. But I could not find the peace in my heart, nor could my wife. And I received good counsel that came from a friend that said, Talmadge, if you can say no and live with your no, say no. When everybody was saying around me politically, it's the thing to do. It's the way to go. I said no, and I lived with my no and had peace in my heart. Before that, I had a call to go to be a district superintendent. I had pastored 2 churches, 1-5, and had pastored the second church that we planted. Totally secure, a growing church. I got a call from the general superintendent whose voice sounded a little bit like God. And he said, I'll give you plenty of time. That was 8 o'clock in the morning. My wife will be by the phone. I need to know something by 11 o'clock. Take your time. I went. It was culture shock. We went to the state of Mississippi. Totally different culture. And it was very traumatic. And in the first 6 months, I questioned often. And I'll never forget, I was lying on a couch. A grown man, the boys were at school. And I cried like a baby. And I said to my wife, Janelle, honey, I'll never have another happy day in my life. Well, thank God he didn't hold me accountable for that. And I gave God a lot of information, and I named off all the names. The generals would never have asked him to come, never have asked him to come, never have asked him to come. But you know, I had a calling, and the mission became important. And God gave me a love for the people of Mississippi, so that when I left Mississippi, it was like leaving home. I just say tonight, it's a marvelous privilege to be a part of this fellowship of brothers and sisters who are called with a mission. And I commend you, Dr. Ward, Fred Fullerton, all of those that have put this together, and I count it a high privilege to come back here to my place of birth. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much. Thank you.